Hello and welcome to the November edition of Cinetopia. I'm here, well, we're a small group this time around. I'm here with Jim Ross, the managing editor of Take One magazine. How are you?
I'm good. I think calling it a group is a little bit optimistic. You know, two's company, I suppose, though. So,
yeah. Well, we've all been a bit busy. The Edinburgh Short Film Festival just ended. Paul's been managing that, of course, for the last 9 years, and it was. What did you think, Jim? I thought it was a fantastic festival this year.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, during the time that I've been paying attention to the Edinburgh Short Festival, the standard has been ridiculously high, and really this year was no different. The prize winners, which I think we might speak about, they were all of a extremely high standard, and it's kind of an indicator of the quality that each had some pretty stiff competition, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, we actually sat down with the winner of the Best Scottish Film, Tom Gentle, and you did an interview with him. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was good. It's if you get the opportunity to seek that out, it's a short film called In the Fall, and it's based upon an Alistair MacLeod short story. It's been relocated from Nova Scotia to Scotland, and it's been done as a single shot. Interestingly, the film which won Best Scottish Film and the film which won Best Film, they were both single. They were both a single shot aesthetic. One is an actual single take, and then this one, In the Fall, it's done a sort of like Birdman, Children of Men type thing where it's stitched together. But it's really well done, and more importantly, both of them do something with it, because it's quite in vogue to do long takes, and it's quite showy, but they actually do something which really adds to the story with it. So yeah, keep an eye out for that interview, because it's a very interesting short film. It's very well done and well deserved of winning that award, I think.
Yeah, and the other sort of things that was going on this past couple of weeks, we had a symposium of film festival directors from all over Europe, places like Sardinia Film Festival, Florence Film Corti, the Balkans Beyond Borders, and so it was a really nice. I got to see that program, and also got to see the Q&A afterwards, where all of these directors sort of talked about all the reasons and how they choose short film, why they're involved in short film festivals to begin with. So I particularly really liked that, as well as the Texan Shorts, which was programmed by the University of Texas's head of department, Paul Steckler, and he had came over as well. And you saw that as well, Jim. It was quite a really strong program.
Yeah, and some of them have won prizes like elsewhere outside of Edinburgh, so it's to be expected they're of a high standard. But they really were really very good, and just good storytelling, really. And there were different types of story. There was drama in there was a comedy one at the end, so a mix of documentary and narrative stuff, but they were uniformly all really pretty good. I'm very impressed by it, and I must admit it's not a film program that I'm aware of. I think people more in the industry know than me are very familiar with it, but I would definitely be keeping an eye out for other student work coming out of there. Because student film is often used as a bit of a pejorative. Oh, it's a bit of a student film. Well, watch some of those and then continue to use that, because really, really very good, very impressive.
Yeah, and as always, the Edinburgh Short Film Festival is full of fun nights afterwards, discussing the films at the Royal Dick Bar and in the Film House Cafe, and a few networking things, including our beginning networking night. So yeah, a really good time. Met a lot of filmmakers from around the world, and film festival directors. So great, well done to Paul and the team, and look for it's going to be the 10th next year, so there's going to be some more stuff for that as well. Moving on to our show today, we have 3 films that we are going to be reviewing. Manos by Alejandro Landis, which comes out, it should be out by now in UK cinemas. The next one is Meeting Gorbachev by Werner Herzog and Andrei Singer. And the final one is The Nightingale, which should come out on the 29th, and that is by Jennifer Kent. So we'll be talking about all of those films, plus Jim sat down with Paul Laverty, the writer of many Ken Loach films, and this recent one, Sorry We Missed You. So we'll talk a little bit about that film, and that's currently on in the UK as well. So plenty for us to talk about here. So, speaking of big films that are coming out right now, the biggest one is most likely The Irishman. Jim, you got to see it somewhere, like at the London Film Festival. Where did you see it?
Sort of. I saw it at the Dundee Contemporary Arts. The DCA.
Oh, right, okay.
So what it was fortunate. It got its UK premiere, maybe even European actually, but certainly UK on October 13th at the London Film Festival. It was like the closing gala, and something they did which was quite interesting was they did basically a simulcast around the country to a bunch of independent cinemas where they basically started showing the film at the same time. It meant that you need to put up some slightly tiresome red carpet gubbins beforehand instead of trailers, but, small price to pay. So, yes, I was back in Dundee that weekend, and I went there because, curiously, there wasn't a showing of it in Edinburgh. Fortunately, Edinburgh audiences will get to see it at the Film House. It's getting a little run there, but... yeah, for some reason, it didn't have one of those on October 13th. But
well, it's one of those things that we've gotten into this with this Netflix thing. There's very, very short runs, and it's sometimes very interesting where they get played, Netflix films, correct?
Yeah, it was curious. I mean, that one confused me slightly because, of course, in Edinburgh terms, the Film House is basically the place to go for this stuff because they got screens of Outlaw King, they got screens of Roma, because you've got that rule with picture house cinemas where there needs to be a exclusive theatrical window. So these films like The Irishman, Marriage Story, and Noah Baumbach one, that's another one which is with Netflix. Because Netflix naturally want it to move to streaming quite quickly, albeit they want the theatrical runs for press and prestige. Because they want them to go there so quickly, it's never going to show up at the likes of the Cameo, the Picture House chain, or any of the major multiplex chains. It's always going to need a Glasgow Film Theatre or a Film House or a Belmont Film House or something like that to show them. It needs to be either a small chain or an independent cinema altogether.
Yeah, and we were just talking that there's probably going to be 3 Netflix films that are really in contention for some of the big awards this year, right? So it's Irishman is probably one of them, and The Marriage Story, is that another?
Yeah, I think The Irishman and Marriage Story are probably the big ones. There's a few others kicking around. I mean, you've got The Two Popes is another Netflix one which is kicking around and will be around. So they've really upped their spending. I mean, I think the last time we spoke about this on the show, what we were really focusing on was Roma, which, this time last year was the thing that was getting a lot of the buzz and causing all the Netflix controversy. But I think it's probably only going to be more so this year because I think The Irishman will factor into it in a big way. And I think certainly for the acting, if not more, Marriage Story, which I also saw at the Cambridge Film Festival, will also feature pretty strongly in that award season chatter, I think.
So I think I saw some of your tweets, and I definitely saw some early reviews about The Irishman and comments from people, and it is sounding like it's a pretty amazing film. So, judging from the Martin Scorsese films I feel like I've seen over the last decade, tell me why there's so much great buzz around this.
Well, to me, and we might review it on the next show, so I'll be interested to see what other folk think of it. But for me, it's a wonderful blend of what Scorsese's capable of in terms of tone. If you look at something like, his last film before this was Silence, right? And it feels like it's blending a lot more to do with the quite deep themes of that sort of film that you can make. So Silence is the most recent one. You can also start talking about things like The Last Temptation of Christ. It feels like a wonderful blend of that with what Scorsese is stereotypically known for, the sort of like the hijinks of criminal hijinks of Goodfellas, of Casino. It seems like, to me, it's the perfect blend of the two of them, because there's a lot of humour in this film. There are bits where I laughed. There are bits where, I was very moved by it. I think it's got the best acting by some of its leads than they've done in a long, long time. I mean, this is the best that Robert De Niro has been probably in at least a couple of decades, to be perfectly honest. It's the best I've seen Al Pacino in decades. And, it's had a lot of chat around it because of the de-aging technology.
Yeah, and did that work?
By and large, yeah. I mean, like, to me, this is a fantastic film. I think my only real criticism of it is when you're looking at their faces. I think this de-aging tech works quite well. I mean, it's not perfect, just as you wouldn't expect anything to be. Like, there's a little, particularly when they make them much younger than they are, it doesn't quite work, but by and large it's very good. The only real genuine criticism I have of it is, even if you make Robert De Niro look like he's in his late 40s, he still moves like a man in his late 70s.
Yeah.
So they're still carrying themselves with the physicality of much older men. So it doesn't quite work that way, but with the way the story is structured, for me it gets away with it, and the rest of it is, I really clicked with it. The rest of it is so wonderful that, that I'm willing to forgive.
Well, I think we're all looking forward to it. So perhaps we'll reconvene next month when we've all had a chance to see it and there are more bodies in the room.
Yeah, and quite frankly, I'll say it right now. If anybody dislikes it, we're going to have words.
Okay.
We're going to have words. The only thing I would say is, like, the other thing that's made headlines for is its length. It's 3.5 hours long.
Which is a classic, like, contemporary Martin Scorsese film, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Silence was 3 hours long.
Please learn how to edit, like in the, but he doesn't. He doesn't
we,
seem to.
We see that's the interesting, like, because I'm not want to give away all my opinion before we do it, but that's an interesting thing, because I think this film, yes, I mean it is long, and I don't think I really felt the length, in the sense that I think it works for the story. But a lot is being said about, how well Martin Scorsese's done with this. Thelma Schoonmaker has done brilliantly with it. This film, to me, is paced to perfection, and a lot of it is down to her editing. I think if and it seems a bit ridiculous to say if Scorsese didn't have Thelma Schoonmaker, because they've worked together for so long, right? But if it didn't have an editor of her caliber working on it, I think it could be more difficult. But her work on this is absolutely fantastic.
Great. Well, go watch The Irishman. Let us know what you think, and we'll let you know what we think when we see it as well. So the first film that we're going to review together is Manos by Alejandro Landis. Jim and I both saw that together at the Cameo, but it's out now. Is it at the Cameo? It's all over the UK then. Yeah,
it might still be at the Cameo, but certainly it's as we broadcast, it should be in the middle of a short run at the Film House as well.
Oh, right, okay. So tell us a little bit about what Manos is about, because it took me a little bit of time in the film to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, so the film's done very well. I think it won Best Film at the London Film Festival. And
oh, really?
Yeah. And basically, the film opens on a group of teenagers who are obviously engaged in some sort of guerrilla warfare type operation. So it's a group of teenagers, boys and girls, and they've kind of got these nicknames which I think are maybe ostensibly meant to evoke part of their personality, but they're Bigfoot and Rambo, Wolf, Lady. I think Boom Boom is another one of them. So they got these, and it opens on a fairly surreal image, which is them playing football blindfolded. And they're kind of staggering around, and you only know a goal has been scored when a bell rings. And then they start interacting with a guy that they only refer to as the messenger. And basically what it turns out is that the messenger is part of this wider organisation, which is obviously fighting some sort of battle in this mountainous South American landscape. So Alejandro Landis, I think, is Colombian, Ecuadorian. Certainly he's got that sort of look about it, like high altitude South American nation. So the messenger is part of this larger organisation, and the group of children that we've been introduced to are the Monos. That's kind of where the title of the film comes from. And they're clearly teenagers, and they get up to this random teenage stuff almost, like they're asking for permission to become partners and enter into relationships. There's hijinks, there's weird kind of like ritualistic dancing around campfires in the evening. They are also, and this is kind of maybe one of the main drivers of what plot there is, right? Because we'll get to that in a minute. They have this, I think she's American, but basically they have a hostage who they only refer to as Doctora. And basically she is in their care, and it's up to them to keep her in, good condition. And right at the start of the film, basically what kind of incites the events of it is they've been given a cow by somebody who is sympathetic to their cause, and the messenger gives it to them and says, look, you've been given this, you can use it for milk and all the rest of it, but you have to return the cow at the end, right? No harm can befall this cow. There's not much of a spoiler to say that obviously harm befalls the cow, right? Yeah. And then there's various things that then spin off the back of that. But it's quite a surrealist film. There's not a lot of context given as a crutch, I would say. You don't actually know what country it's in. You don't actually know what it is they're fighting for. You don't really know even what time and place it's taking place in. There are certain hints here and there, right? You can kind of contextualize that it's not, it's not in the distant past or anything, and it's not maybe even that long ago. But it's very devoid of context, just in the way that the characters are, actually.
Yeah. And I think we both kind of walked down in the same thing. Well, I was watching it and thinking, oh, here's a Lord of the Flies story, and then it just kind of turned into Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now, and we both exclaimed that. And now if you read something like Peter Bradshaw's 5-star review of it, he says the same thing. So there's so much about this that kind of is, well, you said it has no context, has context of stories and films and whatnot that we've seen in the past, but in a new sort of landscape a bit, because it's South America. Yeah, it's a slightly
different setting and tone, I would say, because you and I both said as it came out, it's very Lord of the Flies meets Apocalypse Now, really. I mean, that's what people will come out of it as kind of the cultural touchstones you'll recognise from it. Where it differs, I suppose, is again that lack of context, and also I think the musical approach as well.
Yeah, it was quite. Who's the composer again?
Michael Levy.
Yeah.
Who is the woman who did. What I know from is the score that she did for Under the Skin.
Yeah, great film.
She also did it for Jackie, which I've not seen.
I don't like that film. But Natalie Portman. So
but certainly, the music that goes with this, it did very much remind me of Under the Skin, which of course is another film which is kind of like, unsettling, a bit surreal, absolutely devoid of context, and her score does a lot to sell that sort of tone it's going for. I think if you had a slightly more conventional score, it wouldn't add quite as much to it. It's a very stunning looking film, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, but for me the main takeaways are the acting. I thought all the teenagers playing those roles were very good, but the musical approach, I think, is really what makes it stick in your head a little bit.
Yeah, the soundscape, it's quite visual, it's beautiful. I don't not need context, but it did take me a while to get engaged in the film, and it was a journey across some Amazonian somewhat landscape, and after a while it didn't grab me, and I don't think I was very sad about the cow, and I thought that was a really sad moment until we'll talk about the other films later. We've picked quite a bunch of depressing films, Jim. So that was only the beginning of what was to come for me in my film experience this month. But yeah, no, it did pick up and get more intense, and sort of like, I think maybe as you learned the characters kind of own free will, and the decision of being part of a pack, or being making personal decisions, and and betrayal, and all those Lord of the Flies kind of things you would expect.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, I would say it did grab me from the start, but if I'm nitpicking, I wouldn't say it necessarily kept that hold particularly well in the start. I mean, as I say, so like the sound design is superb, it looks very good, the acting's great, but it did need that. So I think it's maybe about halfway through the film, there is a change in locale, and basically the way these characters are interacting, there's a bit of a step change, and there's a change in pace as well. I think the film definitely needed that. If it settled into a slightly more contemplative mood for the whole thing, I don't think it would have brought it home quite as well. It needed that acceleration and this kind of like the creeping kind of like Heart of Darkness, madness type thing, and the chaos parts of Lord of the Flies to really bring it on a bit, I think. So it's extremely well done. I don't think I'm quite as... for fear of being contrary, I don't think I'm quite as blown away by it as I've seen a lot of people be, but it's definitely a very accomplished film.
Yeah. I mean, I also definitely didn't always understand the motivations of every character, but then again, maybe it's younger people not knowing what to do or, what decision to make or whatnot, because, I mean, I obviously understood Doctora's motivation to get the heck out. Yeah. Which I would, most of that film, sometimes I was like, I want to get out of here too.
I think that's the part where the no context kind of worked for me, though, because it's more, it's made very clear, I think, that these are quite young characters, and it's more, you can't really figure out what's driving them, because I'm not sure they necessarily know. Right. And it's certainly like you see allegiances within that group kind of like turn on a dime and switch up. So I think in that respect, that's maybe where that lack of context plays to the film's ideas. But as I say, it does need that step change that happens about halfway through the film in order to get those character interactions kicking off, because otherwise it's a little bit, it's interesting and well done, but it's a little bit staid. It needed that introduction of a bit of peril and a change of pace to get those character interactions sparking off the way that I think the latter half of the film does very well, and it needed. Yeah,
I think all told, though, it is a film, that we're both saying go see. Make the decision for yourself. It's beautiful. It's the soundscape is stunning, and it gives you something new.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a very accomplished film. It worked for me. I'm not going to sit here and say it will work for everyone, for the reasons that we've outlined. But it sounds great. It looks great. It's a very good film. I'm not surprised that it's done well on the festival circuit, and I think it's well worth seeing.
Great. So the next film that we watched was Meeting Gorbachev, a documentary about Mikhail Gorbachev himself, co-directed by the infamous Werner Herzog and his co-director André Singer. I actually saw André Singer at the International Documentary Festival Amsterdam show a few clips and do like a master class on this. So I'd seen a couple clips of this film about a year ago. The filmmakers meet with Gorbachev, I think, obviously in the later part of his life, and I think they do 3 interviews or so. There's, and it really is a dialogue between Herzog and Gorbachev, and then goes back through, Gorbachev's life, his decisions, and, at the end of his life, as it sort of suggested, because Gorbachev does mention he thinks he has maybe a couple years, or he wants a couple years, where he sees the decisions that he made, what he's proud of and what he's not. I personally I loved the film, and I really got to know a person that you like when you grow up in the 80s and 90s, of this character, some bit of a hero, sometimes not, and I think that it really was a very touching film, and but it also wasn't Herzog asked those tough questions as well, so it was interrogating and also touching and quite moving at the end as well. So I think a couple of us had tears in our eyes.
Yeah, I must admit I wasn't really going into this film necessarily expecting to be moved, to be honest. And Mikhail Gorbachev, he's a figure I'm aware of, but I'm of the sort of age where I was alive when all this stuff was happening with him coming to power in the Soviet Union and perestroika and glasnost and all this stuff, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But I'm too young to really remember any of it, so I've kind of got vague context. But I've never really engaged with Gorbachev as a figure beyond what you kind of see pop up in retrospective news articles and things like that. So on the face of it, Werner Herzog sitting down to talk to an 88-year-old Russian that you don't really know a lot about, on the face of it, it could be quite a hard sell, to be honest. But it's an extremely well-done documentary, and the reason for that, I think, is because of the approach that Herzog, and presumably his co-director Andre Singer as well, who remains behind the camera, and Herzog is in front doing the interviewing, is the approach they take to their questioning. It's not really about dryly what happened. Mm-hmm. It's more rooted in what did Gorbachev feel about it? What is he proud of? What does he feel his legacy is? What does he think is missing from his legacy? And I think it presents a very rounded picture of who is a very interesting character, right? Because obviously that period in European world history is kind of fascinating, and he's a figure at the centre of it. But I think the decision to focus the questioning on what his internal thoughts were about it really makes a huge difference. And that's not to say that there isn't factual, more, I don't want to say bland, that's the wrong word, but more kind of like straight factual information around it. It gives context, but where the heart of the film is in those conversations that Herzog has with Gorbachev.
Yeah, and it obviously reminded me, in the same vein, of films that Errol Morris has done, specifically The Fog of War. But there was kind of unlike in The Fog of War, which I think there's a bit of a uncertainty at the end of inconsistency, and in the interview, there wasn't necessarily inconsistency, but Gorbachev does kind of reveal things that you might not have thought he would have felt, like the disillusion of the Soviet Union was a mistake, is ultimately what I think it comes down to say.
Yeah, well, that's what's quite by trying to dig into what his feelings are on different things. You get this reasonably complex picture. Obviously, he was very on board with the idea of needing to reform communism, as it was put, and make life better for people who were in the Soviet Union at the time. But that doesn't mean that he believes the Soviet Union was necessarily the wrong way to do that. And I think you get hints of how critical he is of Russian politicians that have followed him.
Absolutely.
And like the pair, and they're being a little bit clever about it with the filmmaking as well, because there's not a lot of mention of Putin, right? In terms of people talking about him, he's conspicuous by his absence. The person who kind of gets most of the ire from Gorbachev is Boris Yeltsin, right? Mm-hmm. Who he's a very outspoken critic of anyway. But there is this interesting little shot where, it covers the whole range of Gorbachev's life and career, and there's a segment where, his wife has sadly passed away, and the segment that they show of that is Vladimir Putin paying his respects. So even if it's not engaging with certain things directly, it's very aware of them. But I think it's trying to get to a greater truth about the man, right? It's nodding to the kind of the contemporary politics and what's happening now, but it is more wanting to look at how it's got to that point through the eyes of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah, and I think the masterclass that I had gone to was a lot about the archive that they had access to, because some of the archival footage is really incredible wherever it comes from. And there's one particular scene that really struck me when he was signing his resignation from the USSR, and the main camera, they were pushing him to make to make it a very public thing, and he wouldn't. But then the fact that in this film you have that side camera, you have that other view that was there, but it is quite great for a documentary filmmaker. It's a lovely moment.
Yeah, I think the key thing is it blends them very well, because you've got the conversations, but also the use of archive footage, I find is really informative. It's interesting, and it's been edited superbly, I think, because one of the traps that I think you can probably fall into, and certainly I've seen in documentaries that have engaged me less, is kind of archive footage as window dressing, right? It's just there for context, but it's not particularly meaningful context. That's something that can happen. That's very much not the case here. And in particular, there's a clip from another film which was focusing on Gorbachev, where he's wandering around his house and basically just kind of like bumbling around the garden, really. But the context in which it's used, it's in the segment where he's talking about losing his wife.
Right.
And it turns it from just like this old guy in a suit bumbling around a garden to like really being quite moving and heartbreaking.
Yeah,
it's
and the
like,
family, coming back to see the family and everything. I was just, that was really, really touching. It isn't the most innovative like film, but sometimes I think we're always searching for so much innovation in some formats and stuff, and that doesn't make that, to me, that doesn't make it less of a powerful piece, because I think it does everything it needs to do to tell this particular story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's you've hit the nail on the head there. I think it's not it's not doing anything particularly new, I don't think, but there's a lot to be said for doing it well, and it absolutely does that.
Great. So we highly recommend you see it if you're interested in Soviet history, 80s history, and or a good film. So the final film we're going to review is coming out later in the month, around the 29th in the UK. I think it's Australian-British co-production, The Nightingale, directed by Jennifer Kent. It does take place in Australia. Jim, tell me a little bit about the film.
So it takes place in Australia in the 19th century. So I think it's about the mid 1800s, and it basically follows a young Irish woman who is there as part of a penal colony. She's a convict, and she's under the care of kind of British military forces, and she has been married, and she's due a letter to allow her to leave effectively and go into the care of her husband, basically. This has been denied her. The head of the unit has kind of procrastinated on this and hasn't done it. So basically, without wanting to get into too many details, basically what happens is her reaction to not getting this letter is seen as an act of insubordination, and there's a fight, and basically this woman is wronged really on various different levels, and we'll get into that in a moment. And what then happens is she sets out after these military personnel who have now left on a revenge quest, effectively.
Right. Jim, I don't know if you knew much about the film before you picked it, but you could not have picked a more painful film to watch from I think it's like 7 minutes in, and you're involved in the first rape scene. There's like 3 or 4 in the film. Nobody in this world is having a do time.
No.
It's so devastating.
Yeah, it is. And just giving the number of rape scenes in this film doesn't actually really do justice to quite how difficult it actually is to watch. So this film, I think it's been on the festival circuit, and I first kind of heard about it when it came to the London version of Sundance, and I think it premiered at Melbourne in Australia, and there was a lot of talk about people walking out of the film, and I can see why. To be honest, it is an extremely difficult film to watch. What I would say is it's quite a smart film. I don't think it's not. It has avoided this trope of kind of like rape as an empowerment thing. I do think it avoids that, and the central performance as Claire by Aisling Franciosi, who's an Irish-Italian actress, she's superb. And I think Jennifer Kent's direction is very good. So Jennifer Kent is probably best known for The Babadook, which I've not seen, unfortunately, but certainly, it seems to be very well regarded. And the way that she shot the film, I think, is very interesting. There are quite a lot of horror elements to this in terms of the framing and, the blocking of how characters move through frames and scenes. So it's a very accomplished film. I think it's very well done. I think it's a legitimate question to ask as to the ideas that she's trying to get across and the arc that her characters are going on. There's a question whether it's been maybe pushed just that little bit far. Mm-hmm. I think that is a legitimate concern to bring up. Because really, if you watch this film, basically, I would imagine what you're going to come out of this thinking is that's a really well-made film, but dear God, is it hard to get through.
Yeah, I mean, there's a film that comes to mind, which is way worse than this, that I saw one time in a theater, and it was called 29 Palms. And when I walked out of that, I was like, I want those 2 hours of my life back, because it put me in a very, very bad mood. And whether or not I just saw like a headline of, a review which says necessarily brutal. Does this film need to be this brutal to tell a story about a penal colony and, and rape and, what the British soldiers would have done and what, the way that people were treated? Maybe, but it's such a hard subject matter in a part of history that is and it's very hard to take during a narrative story.
Yeah, and the other thing is, you've touched upon it there. The brutality and the difficulty in this film, it goes beyond the as difficult as they are. It goes beyond the rape scenes, because there's a lot of mistreatment of the native people of Australia in this, which again, given the time and the setting, that is what happened. And I believe that there are, organisations and groups in Australia who testified to the fact that in that respect, the film is accurate. Accuracy notwithstanding, I don't know how well that works on film, and I've always been a bit wary of the term necessarily brutal. Because if you're telling a story, you need people to engage with it in order to get across because basically the journey, the main kind of emotional journey of the film is Claire basically becomes attached to an Indigenous man called Billy. Right, who basically at the start of it, she basically employs him really to accompany her on this journey through the kind of like forested wilderness, effectively, in pursuit of these men who have wronged her. And it starts off as quite an antagonistic relationship. Like she's a little bit racist, he's a little bit racist in response, and they slowly start to kind of like break those barriers down and. I'm making it sound more cliched than I think it comes across, but realize they have more in common than they think. Like there was one part that kind of like raised a smile to my mind when he's kind of getting on his high horse about how dreadful the English are and having a go at her, and she points out she's Irish, she hates the English just as much as he does, and so that's kind of the main emotional arc. And basically it seems to be about finding kind of like common humanity in the face of like what is like pretty brutal behaviour of other human beings. There is a question about whether that it does drown it out, really. Like some of the
the relationship,
as in the brutality, I think drowns out that central relationship a little bit.
Yeah, I think the relationship was the part that just kept me going in this film. The only thing that I could like grasp onto that like wasn't wanting me to walk out, and what was that kind of like survival, coming together and working together to help each other, and the other people which they would find along the way that were somewhat helpful, or like you said, the genuine humanity of some people in the face of a really terrible history and a terrible sense of racism, and obviously other activities that were happening to convicts and women.
Yeah, because there's a certain amount, because obviously the big kind of the elephant in the room with this film is also kind of colonialism, really.
Right.
I mean, this is all driven from, the British in Australia and, everything that entails about, like, how they operated in that country. So you've kind of got the microcosm of their relationship and what that represents, but then the driver for all of it above that is kind of the brutality which is fostered by colonialism. This idea of, people being superior to other races, other peoples, and that sort of thing. I just keep coming back to, I'm very impressed by the film, but I did find it very difficult, and I'm not criticising it from a, it's unnecessarily difficult. I'm not criticising it from it's an unrealistically difficult, because I think everything it shows, based on what I've seen, I mean, it is accurate. This stuff did happen. It was horrible and it was brutal. There is an element of, if you're trying to tell a story, whether you kind of, drag people out of that story by it being so brutal. I mean, there are a couple of scenes where I did find it difficult to make through it. Like, I did kind of breathe a sigh of relief when certain scenes finished. And I feel like maybe I've not engaged with those scenes quite as much as maybe Jennifer Kent intended me to as a result. Now, maybe that's my own problem, but I don't think, based on what I've seen, I'll be the only person who has that reaction to some of those scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same way. My gut reaction to, like you said, very well shot, very well told, story was there. There's no real complaints on the filmmaking capabilities of this film. I'm also not. I also am very sensitive to rape scenes, so that's going to be an immediate thing that I won't usually watch films with that. But my gut response to a film means I need something there that brings me in, draws me to it, and makes and says, wow, that was worth my 2.5 hours or whatnot. This one just was painful.
Yeah, it's a very well made film, but I think it's a classic buyer beware situation, to be honest.
So, trigger alert, I guess.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, for certain. Like, I would be surprised if this film doesn't come with warnings on it and 18 and all the rest of it. It's. So fortunately, I had the pleasure of talking to Paul Laverty, who's the screenwriter of Sorry We Missed You, which is Ken Loach's most recent film. So that came out on release at the start of the month. I don't know if it's playing at this precise moment. It may well have left cinemas, but it is getting a short run at the Film House from the 22nd until the 28th of November. So you will have a chance to catch it again. It's a really excellent film. It's basically centred on a man who works in the gig economy. He works as a delivery driver, and it kind of follows the strains that puts on his family life, along with his carer wife, played, I think the character's name is Debbie, who's on a 0 hours contract. So it basically goes into a very well-told story about the strain that puts on their family life and just being able to live. So fortunately, I got a chance to talk to Paul Laverty before he did a Q&A at the Cameo earlier this month. So we'll go straight into the interview, and basically I started off by asking him why they chose to focus on that particular aspect of the gig economy, because there's various different ways it could be represented, and then we got into what they were trying to achieve with the film, the response, and how they went about making it. There's many aspects of the gig economy you could have focused on, because obviously it has so many different facets and so many different ways that people are engaging with it. What was it that made you focus upon delivery drivers of the sort of Amazon DPD nature in particular? Was it just the research, or was there something about that particular thing that...
No, it's a good question, and yeah, there are many options, but the drivers and the couriers gives us a lot of levels, always like that. First of all, you've got the extreme control with the scanner or the gun that they call it, so it measures everything. We now see the death of the high street. We see more and more shops going bust. We see city centres dying. There's the whole environmental question now as well. Is that a good model really for one exploited driver, running around and delivering shoes and socks and curries and vapes and some of the crazy things I heard that were delivered? Meanwhile the drivers are massively exploited, and then there's pollution all over the place. They zigzag out of order because they must meet precisers. It ties in with extreme demand from consumers, and of course it ties in with these great monstrous companies, like Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And so if you do this, there's lots of levels to it. And then if you mix that with someone who's a carer and 0-hour contracts, looking after our older people, there's a demographic time bomb. And how are we looking after our old people? And so we just thought, well, let's have a look at precarious work and make a very intimate portrait of a family and see how much time these adults actually spend with their children. And of course it begs a great big existential question about how much time do you spend with your children? What is the point of work if you can't look after your children properly? So there was kind of great richness in it, and I suppose that's what attracted us to it.
So, on a similar sort of theme, so obviously Daniel Blake dealt with the welfare state, or at least certainly the way this government has been treating it, their attitude to it, and the effect that has on actual people. What made you want to stay in that area? Because obviously this is a different thing, but it is related, and obviously the Abby character, her arc is kind of intrinsically linked to cuts and how we deal with kind of looking after society. What made you want to remain within that area?
I suppose we kind of imagine that the Turner family, this is, in the Turner family we deal with, probably lived, a few streets down the road from Daniel Blake. So we see it as a companion piece. But they're very different worlds. Daniel Blake was about the world of welfare, about an older man. He was quite isolated in some senses. Yes, we imagined this was a family that, just really lived a couple of doors along the street from Daniel Blake. So it was a companion piece. And one is the world of welfare and how strict and vicious that can be. We see people who are in their last months of life are deemed to be fit for work. We came across that barbarity and systematic cruelty by the state. But in a strange way, I think you need a kind of a barbaric system in welfare if you're going to try and keep people in these terrible precarious jobs who are pushed to the limit. So there is a kind of a connection between them, and there is a method in their madness. And we also just wanted to look at a young family. The world of work dictates so much about our lives and the quality of our lives and how much time we spend. And another thing, of course, when we actually did the research for Daniel Blake, we went to food banks up and down the country, and we heard so many stories from people, and you look them in the eye and you try to understand the intricacies and the detail of their life. And what struck us was there were so many people who were working in precarious work, so they had jobs. It was the working poor. It wasn't just people who were unemployed or couldn't work. And so that really made us question, how is it? What's happening to work? The precarious nature of it, agency work, 0-hour contracts, gig economy, where so many people had to go to a food bank to feed their children. I mean, that is a real massive seismic shift under the surface. So we really wanted to examine all of that.
One thing I wanted to ask you about in that respect was also the character of Maloney, so the warehouse boss. And obviously, it would be very easy to fall into something very caricatured there. But I found that certainly wasn't the case. In particular, there's that point where he gets the chance to explain his rationale.
Yes. And
it's, to my mind, flawed rationale, but you can at least see it's more the system rewards that.
Yes, and I think that's a very good question. I'm glad you've raised it, because I didn't want to see him to be the central casting bad guy at all. In fact, I remember when we were speaking to Ross, we were saying, this man is actually, he feels he has to be cruel to be kind. He says he wants to form a protective cover over his depot so that they win the contracts and thereby look after the families he's responsible for. And so he's brutal. He calls himself, well, I better not say the words in case it cuts you out from community radio, but he calls himself, he has a certain description of himself, and he kind of revels in that. But it's not him, it's the bad guy, it's the system. He is in that position because he fulfills a role, and he has just been carrying out the logic of that role. They must keep the scanner happy, because the scanner must be satisfied, and if that hits its targets, they win more contracts from Zara and John Lewis and Amazon and wherever. So for him, it's actually in the logic of capital that he must do that. So he's not the bad guy. He's just. But you need characters like that to carry it out, you know.
On that note, in terms of, because I'll say it would have been easy to make him a caricature, but he's not. I know from your previous statements on this, you do a lot of research into understanding the characters and kind of the stories that need to be told here. What is it you hope the reaction is? Because obviously there's a certain level of predictable reaction from people who are predisposed otherwise, shall we say. But from a social perspective, what is it you hope the response is?
Well, we had the usual hysterical reaction from conservatives and conservative supporters, and as we did with I, Daniel Blake, they said it was exaggerated, but then they were hit with tons of tweets and information that overwhelmed them, and they realised that we'd only scratched the surface. And some of them have started on the same thing now with the couriers. And for those people who accuse of exaggerating, I like to tell people the story of Don Lane, who was a driver of DPD, who was a man who had diabetes. He was 52 years of age. I met his wife after the screening, actually. I didn't meet her till after the film was made. But Don, he got fined £150 per day when he couldn't find a replacement driver when he had important specialist appointments. And anyway, so he missed a few of those, and then he had more specialist appointments, but he couldn't afford to get the fines. He was scared of getting into debt. He was under great stress, couldn't find replacement drivers, which sounds easy, but because they're now deemed to be self-employed, they carry the responsibility of that. If you were ill before, you would just get sick pay. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, he became more and more ill. One of his fellow workers said, "Don, you're breaking up. You're falling apart." His wife was very worried about him. Then it was over a Christmas period. They had lots of deliveries to do. On the 4th of January, I think it was 2018. I think that was the year he died. 2018, he died of complications. This is a 52-year-old man who should still be with us today. He should still be with his lovely wife, Ruth. And he was trapped inside a logic like that. DPD have since banned that £150 fine. But a lot of these companies now, they just change the language. They say 3 strikes and they're out, and they find a different way to do it. But the point is, all risk with these self-employed contracts, they're bogus self-employed contracts. They don't call them workers, they call them owner-driver franchisees. They don't get hired, they become on board. You don't get paid a salary, you paid a fee. So they've got all this language, and they create this language so that you, the driver, which every single moment of your life is controlled by this scanner because it knows where you are, what position you're in, where you put the parcels, the moment you clock on to the moment you clock off. You're deemed to be a free entrepreneur who decides his own fate. And it's absolute bollocks. So I think what you see now is how technology is used not to liberate but to enslave people. And then when you see Abby on the other side with her 0-hour contracts, her working day is spread out from first thing in the morning till late at night. She gets people up in the morning, gives them breakfast. There's the meds at lunchtime and meals, and at night time the tuck-ins. And then there's all these spaces during the day where she doesn't get paid. She has to pay her own travelling expenses. Oftentimes when you measure all that out, it's less than the minimum wage. So again, it suits the employer because they don't pay them when it doesn't suit them to work. But once again, you see families, family life, the rhythm of family work totally destroyed. So when I hope people see this, they'll say, well, it suits the market. It suits the shareholders, it suits the big giant corporations, but it doesn't suit us, it doesn't suit the community, it doesn't suit children, it doesn't suit the schools when the children are tired and they don't have the supervision of their parents, they're not having their homework, there's no family cohesion. There's a kind of a madness in it. So I hope people get really, really mad and say, well, this is why Jeff Bezos has got 150 billion. Why all these tech companies, tell us there's no alternative. And what they do is they squeeze more and more profit and crush people. That's what they're doing. They're crushing people, and they're using technology to do it. Those people are manacled to these, just as surely as a slave was to the irons way back. And the wonderful English poet from 200 years ago, William Blake, talked about mind-forged manacles. In other words, how we enslave our own brains. And And I think that's what's happened with these bogus self-employed contracts. You're an entrepreneur, it's your business. So if you're not a millionaire and have your own franchisee in 5 years, you're a failure. You're moderately weak, you haven't got enough intelligence, you're not creative enough, you're not working hard enough. So once again, the blame falls on the person. So it suits the market, but it doesn't suit us. We're not just consumers. You know, we're workers, we're neighbours, we're community members, we're part of something. And what we're doing is we're destroying the fabric of the most intimate space that we have, which is our lives. All that new language. And of course, they've got teams of psychologists and lawyers and PR. I mean, the people who design these onboarding, all this language, you know, and it's absolute, you know, let's call it for what it is. It's absolute total bullshit. And the people who live through it, they know they're trapped in it when they're in it. Now, what they'll do is they'll present, you know, workers who get a few hours work, you know, retired people who do a couple of hours here and there when it suits them, you know, and that's okay. But for people who've got families or people who have got to earn their monthly income, all power is with the corporation. 0-hour contract. You're hired when the corporation wants you. You can't say, no, I'm not working today. You're at their beck and call. Oftentimes you can't work for other people. So all the power is with the corporation, but they use the language of freedom and choice, which is an absolute farce.
One thing I wanted to ask you about was, obviously, in your case, you've done quite a lot of work on social causes from a more direct involvement. Obviously, in terms of you've done humanitarian work, you used to work as a human rights lawyer. What is it about the creative process, and screenwriting in particular? What is the power there that you think you find? Because clearly there's something there that speaks to your ideas about being able to instigate something or communicate something. What is it that you find is different compared to the way you've engaged with these issues in your earlier life?
Well, I mean, I suppose Ken and myself, we've worked together now for over 25 years. We've done a whole number of films together. I can't remember now, is it 14 features and several shorts? And I suppose you're motivated by what's going on around you, trying to understand the world, trying to figure out how power works in our lives. But what we want to do is tell great stories. You know, we don't want to have this. They're not manifestos. You know, they're not kind of two-dimensional pamphlets, I hope. I mean, you have to just find rich stories. So when people see Sorry I Miss You, I hope they'll see an intimate of a modern family, all the intricacies and subtleties and the nuances of different relationships, you know, daughter to father, you know, partners between them, sibling relationships, you know, and mother to son. And it's endlessly complex and fascinating, and I hope people will recognise, you know, some of their friends or neighbours or some of themselves in it. So I suppose we try to tell stories so that will resonate, and hopefully people will come up with a few questions. You know, but films themselves don't change anything, but they can add to the conversation. You know, with Daniel Blake, I think it helped undermine the stereotype of people on welfare and the grand lies propagated by the state. And I hope, you know, we'll do the same thing here, but what I think, to change anything is going to take radical political action. And I noticed there, I'm not a member of the Labour Party, but I did notice that John MacDonald in his last party conference speech down in Brighton just a couple of weeks ago, he said the first thing they would do is they would get rid of 0-hour contracts. Every worker would have trade union rights from the first day they started. Everybody will get the living wage, and they will outlaw subcontracting for carers. Now, if they did that, it's not a revolution, Jim, but what it would be a remarkable turnabout in the lives of millions of workers. And what we've noticed too is that this isn't just about the UK. We've just come back from, you know, Ireland and Italy and France, where we showed the film to 1,100 workers. It's the same story there, precarious work, chambermaids, cleaners, courier drivers. I just got a letter today from someone in Brazil. I got another letter today from our Japanese distributor to see how it's resonating there. So all this use of technology, precarious work, you know, and people not getting to the end of the month, is now becoming absolutely universal with this system. So I think it begs the big question, how we begin to recognise that the market, the so-called free market, is a nonsense, and we have to plan work and plan our lives in a way that's more sustainable and more humane.
So one other thing I want to ask you about was the setting of Newcastle, because obviously that's been maintained between Daniel Blake and what is it? I've heard both you and Ken Loach speak very favourably about the likes of Glasgow, Liverpool, and other cities in the UK. What is it about Newcastle that made you want to keep the setting for the story there?
Well, there are artistic reasons and there's practical reasons. Because everybody in Daniel Blake, you know, all the small parts, that turns into the whole. And the city gave us great life. There's great personalities there. The accent's vital. The people are fun. There's a bounce to them. And some cities just have a spark about them. I think Glasgow has it. I think Liverpool has it. And Newcastle definitely has it. Maybe it's something to do with its working class history or not. But there's a mix there. And there's also great variety. I mean, you know, the Victorian city centre is absolutely stunning in Newcastle. And then it's got all sorts of varieties, and and the great thing about it is you can get around it quickly as well. You're not stuck in traffic for 2 hours trying to get to a location. And also there was great support from the city. You really felt there was a buoyancy there and well received. People made it easy for us, and there was a kind of a generosity of spirit. So we just thought, you know, this is a companion piece to Daniel Blake and it'll work very well here.
With that in mind, in your script, when you conceived the characters, was Ricky always going to be Mancunian, or is that something that came from the casting of Chris?
Well, I mean, what we do, the casting is a long process, and we've got a brilliant casting director called Colleen Crawford, who's worked with us for a long time. And what Ken always says is, well, we try to find the best person who gives flesh and blood to the character as imagined in the script. You know, so we saw people all over. We saw a brilliant Glaswegian who was terrific, and we saw lots of good people, but we didn't want it just to be based in Newcastle. And Chris, we just felt, was, you know, very close to the character as we imagined. I mean, he'd done some acting beforehand, but he'd run his own business. He was a plumber. He had his own van. He knew that world. And I think he just believed him as a courier driver. Debbie, who was absolutely quite brilliant, she'd done a few scenes as extras, but she was a teaching assistant, and she just had a quality about her that we just imagined that was very, very close to Abby in the film. And then the 2 kids were local kids who were just terrific. So we just tried to create a believable family. But I think Ken always makes brave choices. You know, we sit down and we do it together with Rebecca, and we try and just decide who fits best. But he always makes brave choices, and I think they did a really original job in this, because I think you actually really do believe it's a family.
On a kind of a similar note with all of that, so I was fortunate enough to speak to Ken several years ago, just after The Angel's Share came out, and he spoke about the perception of your films, so your collaborations with him, as being political, or from his view, not being political. Is that something you share, in the sense that you don't conceive them as stories that are meant to make a political point, but it's more in telling the stories of actual people, it comes to make a point that you feel is valuable? Well,
making a point makes it sound like a manifesto, and we try and avoid that. What we want to do is have rounded characters and a rich story acts in many different levels, and if you do that well, you know, I think the politics flows from it naturally, but it's not forced out of it. You know, when you watch The Bicycle Thieves, you know, that beautiful neo-realist film from Rome after the war, you know, it's a simple story about a man trying to get a bike, but what you do is you just see the devastation and the unemployment and the hunger and the precariousness of their whole lives just through a simple tale. Now that's massively political. And then, of course, there are other films that are massively political, especially the big, huge American budgets, which are often very, very right-wing. Massively political, in my opinion, but they're deemed to be entertainment. So how a film is called political or non-political, or called, you know, kitchen sink drama, or, you know, gritty socialist realism, I mean, I don't really go for any of these great. I think it just distracts from what's in front of your eye. I just think people should try and just see just try and engage with the story and have an open mind about it. I think that's what we try and achieve.
In that mind, some of the slightly more hysterical reactions to, in particular, Daniel Blake, but I'm sure this one's going to get them as well. Unfortunately,
that doesn't bother us.
Is there something about the fact that you're telling a fictional story that you've come up with now, albeit it's based in research and it's based in real people, which makes it indisputable in the sense that because of this kind of like post-truth era we seem to be living in, people will question anything, but because you have ownership of this story and it's conveying, I like to think, a greater truth beyond the specifics of a specific situation. Is there something about that can't be refuted, whereas something in a documentary or some sort of statistic that's been interpreted a certain way could be now?
Well, it's what we try and do. I mean, this is a totally fictional story, but it's after Ken and myself and have absorbed and done a lot of really digging, especially when that's my job to do that digging really, and then share it with Ken, and that's very, very important for us. Now, for Daniel Blake, it's really hard to get your head around the welfare legislation. And once you even get your head around the law, then you have to get your head around how it's lived and practiced, the lived experience of it. And you can only do that by spending time with people and really being rigorous. And so after doing all that, then what you do is try and forget it, because there's so many hundreds of options. You can't copy a screenplay from the street. You can't copy a screenplay from the research. Now you have to forget it, and then it's the imaginative leap to invent the characters and pick the premise and try and choose the right people, and then sort out the narrative. Now that's the really complicated, difficult bit. Now it's fictional, but if we hadn't done that well, and if we had lied about what those characters did in Daniel Blake, it'd have undermined the whole project, and the Tories would have screwed us. But they couldn't do that. They never found that gap. They tried to say we were exaggerating, and every time they did, people came back and said, well, that's nonsense, and here's the A, B, C, and D of it. So eventually, I think it was mentioned about 8 times in Parliament, I think they started trying to ignore it. But that was very important that it was resilient, and really, really important for me and Ken that it stands up. Otherwise, they'll use any little mistake that we might have made to try and drag down the whole piece. And I'm sure they'll try and do the same thing here. But we're not really worried about that. We welcome the debate.
It's a wonderful film. Thank you for speaking to me. I hope it does extremely well, especially in its forthcoming run at the Film House. Paul Laverty, thank you for speaking to me.
A great pleasure, Jim, and thanks for your interest and your really sharp questions. Really enjoyed this conversation with you.
Thank you.
So that's it for our November edition. We have by the time this is broadcasted, we would have just done one of our first Cinetopia would have just done one of our first family-friendly screenings of musicals at Lee Theatre, Singing in the Rain, and the next one for that will be December 8th, White Christmas. But we are having a Cinetopia cinema night with the famous and romantic comedy Big on the 27th of November. So check out that. And stay tuned to our next networking night should be announced quite shortly. Jim, what's going on with you?
So I mean, continuing to write about film, as is my want. So I think the next thing that I've got in mind that I found out about and noticed recently is Cinematic are doing the Scottish Catalan Film Festival.
Oh yeah, that looks amazing.
So that starts at the end of the month and then it runs until I think December 8th, something like that. So I'll be going to a few of those events, writing about some of those films. It looks like it should probably be a pretty strong programme. It's a very interesting region for cinema anyway, because the so much of the Cambridge Film Festival that I was at last month, they always have a Catalan strand. I think I'll probably be checking that out.
Well, that sounds great, and hopefully hopefully we'll all get to go to that as well. So yeah, that wraps us up. Cinetopia. Well, this month's episode has been produced by Jim Ross, managing editor of Take One magazine, and myself, Amanda Rogers, co-founder of Cinetopia. And if you want to learn more about us, we're at Cinetopia on Twitter and at Cinetopia Hub on Instagram and Facebook. So check that out, and see you next month.